They entered the university to study faith and discovered a language older than prayer. Their research was sealed in an unmarked archive. Their bodies were never found, but sometimes, when the wind passes through the abandoned cloisters, the bells still ring, spelling out their names. The forest comes first, a vast canopy of dark fir and ash, bending under centuries of wind. Mist moves between the trunks like slow breath, thick, pale, almost deliberate, and somewhere beyond it, a bell tower, half buried in ivy, rising from the fog like a finger pointing toward a forgotten god. This is St. Veritas University, hidden deep in northern Europe, founded in 1631 on the ruins of a Benedictine monastery that had burned to ash a decade earlier. They said it was built for faith and knowledge, for a new world where theology could meet science. But from the beginning, there were questions. Lux in silentio, light in silence. The university's motto, carved into every stone lintel, etched above lecture halls, and printed on every crest. It sounded noble, but in time, silence would be all that remained. The oldest records describe the founding with pride, how a wealthy bishop, Matthias von Ehren, donated land and gold to rebuild what the fire had taken. He called it a sanctuary for the pursuit of divine truth, but the land itself resisted the idea. Construction workers wrote about tools that vanished overnight, horses refusing to cross the northern field, the bell that wouldn't ring, no matter how hard they pulled. Then when it finally did, the tone came out wrong, too low, too long, as if echoing through something hollow beneath the earth. Still, the university opened. Austere stone buildings, cold marble corridors, lecture halls lit by candlelight, filled with scholars in dark robes, their voices echoing against vaulted ceilings. They came from across Europe, theologians, scientists, philosophers, all searching for that impossible balance between faith and reason. For a while they found it. The early decades were bright ones. St. Veritas became a center of thought, known for its precision, its discipline, its devotion to truth. Students described an almost sacred silence in the libraries. Every sound, every breath, seemed absorbed by the walls themselves, as if the stones were listening. But something wasn't right. In 1654, a letter from a visiting scholar mentioned that no birds nested near the campus, that the trees around the chapel had begun to wither, and that the nights were unnaturally long. As if dawn forgets this place. The university denied it, of course. They had reputations to protect, patrons to please, but in the margins of student journals, hidden under Latin phrases and geometry proofs, the same word appears again and again, sub terram, below the earth. They said the foundations of the main building were laid over the monastery crypts, but that wasn't entirely true. What they found beneath the ruins wasn't a crypt at all. It was something older, older than the church, older than the name of the land itself. Workers uncovered chambers that didn't match any known architectural style, circular rooms carved directly into the bedrock, walls blackened as if by fire, no crosses, no symbols, only a mark, a circle divided by a single vertical line. It appeared everywhere, on the walls, the ceilings, even on the stones used for the new foundation. No one knew what it meant, but they used the stones anyway. Every building at St. Veritas rests on them. At first it was only superstition, whispers, students refusing to study in the lower floors after dark, candles that burned out too quickly, ink that dried before the pen touched the paper. Then came the disappearances. In 1672, a professor of divinity, Henrik Talvik, vanished from his study, leaving behind an open Bible, the last words underlined twice in ink. The light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. A year later, 3 students disappeared from the same wing. Their books remained neatly stacked on their desks, chairs pushed in, candles still burning, No one heard them leave, no one saw them return. No bodies were ever found. The administration ordered silence. Officially, there were no disappearances, only transfers, withdrawals, clerical errors, but inside the walls fear spread like mold, and that's when people began to notice the sound, a low hum, faint, continuous, like air moving through a hollow pipe. It came from beneath the floors. You couldn't quite tell where it began or ended. Some said it was the wind, others said it was the earth breathing. By the winter of 1680, the hum had become part of life at St. Veritas. Students studied by candlelight, the vibration thrumming faintly through the tables. At night, it grew louder, especially near the old chapel. A custodian named Elias Moore was the first to complain formally. He wrote that the floorboards moved like lungs, that the air in the chapel was too heavy, as though it remembered what happened here. 2 days later, he was found at the edge of the forest, clothes soaked, eyes open, lips moving silently, as if repeating something he could no longer say. After that, they sealed the lower crypts, bricked them up, locked the doors. No one was to enter without written permission from the rector himself. But fear doesn't obey authority. Students dared each other to spend a night in the forbidden halls. One came back pale, trembling, unable to speak. He withdrew from the university the next day. Before leaving, he handed a note to his roommate. It read, "Light cannot live where silence was born." Through the following century, St. Veritas survived wars, plagues, political collapse. Empires rose and fell, yet the university remained untouched, too remote, too self-contained, too silent. Even the walls seemed to move around it, but the silence deepened. Fewer students, fewer professors willing to live there. Records grow thin after 1810, entire semesters missing from the archives, names erased. Visitors in the 19th century describe an institution trapped in a kind of permanent twilight. Classrooms left empty, lecture notes half-written, candles still standing where no one had been for years. They wrote of a chill that began not in the air, but in the bones, of echoes that didn't quite match their source. And then one winter night in 1846, the bell rang again. For the first time in over a century, no one was supposed to touch it, but the sound carried for miles, a deep metallic cry that rolled through the mountains. Those who heard it said it felt like the world holding its breath. When villagers climbed up to the campus the next morning, they found the place deserted, doors unlocked, fires still burning in the hearths, food left half-eaten on tables, but no one there, not a single person. Professors, students, servants, all gone. Every clock on the campus had stopped at the same time, 3:17 a.m. Authorities searched for months. They found no graves, no bodies, no tracks, just a campus suspended in the moment it was abandoned, as if life had stepped out mid-breath. They called it the vanishing of St. Veritas, a tragedy without evidence, a silence no one could explain. For decades, the ruins stood untouched. Ivy crawled over lecture halls, rain filled the courtyards, frost cracked the windows. Locals avoided the road that led there. They said the mist never lifted, that even on clear days, the air around St. Veritas shimmered slightly, as if it were not entirely in this time. Today, the university remains, hidden by the forest, guarded by silence. Only a handful of researchers have ever gone there in recent years. One of them, a historian named Marta Lindholm, described her visit in an unpublished journal. She wrote of the cold, how her voice echoed twice when she spoke, and how, in the central courtyard, beneath the moss and cracked stone, she found the university's crest carved into the ground, the circle divided by a single vertical line, the same mark found in the monastery ruins 3 centuries before. She didn't stay the night. No one ever does, because when the wind moves through the trees, softly, quietly, almost like a sigh, you can still hear it, a hum, deep, low, constant, as if the silence beneath St. Veritas was never empty, just waiting. The camera drifts through fog. The ruins of St. Veritas emerge slowly, blurred, gray, half swallowed by the forest. Light moves across broken windows. The air feels still, too still, as though the world itself has been holding its breath for centuries. Inside, corridors stretch into the dark, stone arches, cracked with age, walls covered in ivy, its roots like veins pressing against the cold surface. What remains of the university feels untouched, frozen between time and silence. For decades, historians believed St. Veritas was divided into 16 academic departments: theology, philosophy, natural science, medicine, law, each with its own hall, its own crest, its own forgotten archives. Every record, every ledger, repeats the same number, 16. But something wasn't right. In 1972, a team from Uppsala University was granted rare access to the archives of St. Veritas, or what was left of them. Among the damp parchment and soot-blackened ledgers, they found an older set of blueprints. These were not copies, but originals, drawn in ink that had faded almost to nothing. The edges burned as if someone had tried to destroy them. At first it seemed ordinary: rectangular wings, the chapel, dormitories, the central courtyard. But in the lower right corner, almost lost in the dust, there was something else. A narrow corridor, extending beyond the east wing, leading to a room with no number, no notes, no label, only a faint word written in the same hand as the rest: Aula 70, Hall 17. The discovery caused confusion. There was no record of any 17th hall in the university's history. No classes, no professors, no sign it ever existed. And yet, on the blueprint, it was clearly there, sealed behind an older wall. They went back through every document they could find, and in one crumbling notebook from 1642, belonging to the first rector, Father Matthias von Ehren, they found a strange entry: 16 halls for the disciplines of light, one to guard the word that must remain unspoken. At the time, the scholars dismissed it as metaphor, a relic of medieval superstition. But years later, when a restoration project began at the ruins, they found it again: a corridor where no corridor should exist. The workers uncovered it by accident, beneath a collapsed stairwell on the east side, where the foundation stones had split apart. Behind the debris, a wall of iron and mortar, far older than the rest of the structure. When they cleared the rubble, a sealed doorway emerged. It was small, no wider than a man's shoulders, an arched frame of blackened iron, the hinges fused by time, and across the surface, a Latin phrase etched deep enough to still catch the light: verbum absconditum, the hidden word. The team hesitated. At first they thought it might lead to storage, or perhaps one of the crypts beneath the monastery foundation, but the structure didn't match anything else in the building. The iron was different, purer, harder, almost untouched by rust. When they tested the walls surrounding it, they found something stranger still. It was double-layered, stone on the outside, lead beneath, as though someone had tried not just to hide what was inside, but to contain it. And that was when the records end. No official report describes what happened next. Only fragments survive: letters, transcribed interviews, brief notes written in the margins of personal logs, enough to suggest that the restoration was stopped abruptly, that the site was sealed again, under government order. But one man kept writing. His name was Anton Kraus, an architectural historian from Germany, hired to supervise the excavation. His journal was recovered years later, found in his family's attic. It describes the day they broke the seal. He writes that the air inside was warm, too warm for a space that had been closed for centuries. It smelled faintly of wax, of iron, and something else, something sweet, like old incense. Inside there was a single corridor, narrow, arched, every surface covered in dark residue. as if smoke had moved through the stone and never left. They followed it carefully, light flickering across walls that seemed to absorb it rather than reflect it. After several meters, they reached another door, wood this time, charred around the edges, but still intact. Across the top was the same inscription, verbum absconditum. Kraus noted that the hinges were reversed. The door opened inward, not outward, which meant he realized that it had been sealed from the outside. He hesitated. He wrote that for the first time in his career, he felt as though opening a door could be a moral act or a sin. But they opened it anyway. Inside the 17th hall, they found no furniture, no desks, no signs of study, only a single table at the center, stone, circular. On its surface, faint carvings of letters and numbers, layered over one another, centuries of writing eroded into a pattern almost unreadable. No one could identify the language. Some fragments resembled Greek, others Coptic, and beneath them, faint scratches that might have been older still. At first, Kraus thought it was a prayer, but when he traced the symbols, he realized there were too many repetitions, too deliberate to be liturgical. It looked more like a formula, or an attempt to encode sound itself. And then, on the far wall, they found something else. A series of empty shelves, perfectly symmetrical, and one missing stone, a hollow, exactly large enough for a book, but there was no book, only dust. They searched the floor, the cracks, the corners, nothing. It was as if the object that belonged there had been deliberately removed long ago. Kraus ended his notes that day with a single line. The air hums again at night. We thought it was the wind, but the others don't hear it. For 3 nights, his team stayed on site. By the 4th, the workers refused to enter the east wing. They said they heard footsteps behind the wall, soft, deliberate, too heavy to be rats or birds. One described it as breathing, another said it sounded like someone reciting words, but in a language that slid through the mind without meaning. No one could agree on what was being said, only that it didn't sound human. By the end of the week, Kraus had sealed the door again. He left the site, returned to Berlin, and resigned from the project. He never published his findings, but in his final entry, dated 6 months later, he wrote something that would later puzzle historians. 16 halls for light, 1 for silence, and the silence still speaks. After that, he disappeared. No record of death, no grave, only a missing persons notice filed by his wife in 1974. Decades passed. The ruins of St. Veritas fell quiet again, but those who ventured into the archives after the restoration noticed something strange. A new page had been added to the blueprint, in faint pencil, at the bottom of the map, where hole 17 had once been marked. Someone had written a second Latin phrase, noli desere verbum. Do not speak the word. No one knows who wrote it. The handwriting doesn't match Kraus's or anyone from his team, but the graphite was fresh. Today, if you walk through the eastern ruins, you can still find traces of the 17th hall, a narrow outline beneath layers of stone and moss. If you press your ear against the wall, you'll hear nothing. Not the wind, not the forest, not your own breath, just silence. Absolute, heavy, perfect. That those who've stayed long enough say it doesn't last. That if you listen too long, the silence begins to move. It folds in on itself, like a held note trembling before it breaks, and beneath it, faint, rhythmic, almost like words being whispered through the stone. No one knows what they say. No one dares to listen twice, because whatever is sealed behind that door, whatever the hidden word truly was, it was never meant to be spoken. And those who've tried to understand it never finish the sentence. The snow came early that year. It moved across the valley like a slow tide, burying the trees, the road, the old railway track that ended just before the forest. And there, at the edge of everything, stood the ruins of St. Veritas. The walls were half frozen, the windows broken, the chapel roof sagging beneath the weight of years. What had once been a university was now only stone and shadow. But something still lived there, not alive in any way that could be measured or touched, only remembered. It was January 1898 when the first carriage arrived. 17 scholars in total, linguists, theologians, archaeologists, each summoned by a letter sealed with a wax crest, none of them recognized. The invitation had been formal, elegant, written in perfect Latin. To those who study the word and the silence between, come to St. Veritas. A discovery awaits that will redefine both. They came from Oxford, from Vienna, from Rome. Men and women, accustomed to libraries, to manuscripts, to quiet rooms filled with dust and patience. They expected ruins. They expected history. They did not expect what they found. The university was supposed to be abandoned, and yet when they arrived, the main gates were already open. The courtyard was swept clean. Candles still burned in the chapel. The man who greeted them called himself curator. No first name, no surname. A tall, pale figure in a black coat that looked centuries old. He spoke softly, his voice distant, as if remembering each word before saying it. He told them that excavations beneath the old chapel had revealed a vault of manuscripts, texts written in an unclassified language, carved into thin sheets of copper and pressed between layers of stone. They were found in perfect order, as if deliberately preserved, each inscribed with symbols that seemed both ancient and strangely familiar. The scholars were told their task was simple: to translate, to read what time had hidden. But something wasn't right. The chapel stood at the heart of the ruins, its walls patched with iron, the floor cracked open by the dig. At its center, a circular pit descended into darkness. A wooden platform had been built over it, supported by ropes that creaked when anyone stepped near. From below rose a faint warmth and a smell like old paper, salt and oil. The first night passed in quiet work. They unpacked lanterns, microscopes, notebooks. Everywhere they looked, the same marks appeared: the circle and the vertical line, the sign of St. Veritas, but older, sharper. One of them, Professor Ormond, a linguist from Paris, noticed something peculiar. The script on the copper plates wasn't carved. It was pressed outward, as if written from beneath, as if the letters were trying to surface. He mentioned it to the curator. The man only smiled. "Language is never silent," he said, "only waiting to be heard." By the second night, they began their work in earnest. The air inside the chapel was heavy, every sound swallowed by the vaulted ceiling. Each scholar took a set of plates, tracing symbols, comparing fragments, whispering translations to themselves. But the language resisted them. It shifted, letters changed shape between readings, sentences rearranged. Arendt wrote that it felt as though the text knows when it's being watched. Another, Dr. Helena Roth from Basel, described hearing faint murmurs when she studied the plates for too long. Not words, exactly, but rhythm, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to her. They worked through the nights, sleeping in turns, their candles burning down to black stubs. Outside, the snow thickened. The road back to town disappeared. By the fifth day, the first translation was complete. They gathered in the chapel, the curator standing silently beside them, as Arendt read aloud the opening lines of the recovered text. The words were simple, almost childlike. Before the word was spoken, it was heard. Before the light was born, it listened. The sound of his voice echoed strangely in the vaulted space, too loud, too full, as if the walls themselves were repeating it in secret. That night, several of the scholars reported dreams of corridors without end, of voices reciting fragments they hadn't yet translated. One dreamed of a mouth carved in stone, whispering in a language that wasn't meant for air. The next morning, one of the plates was missing. They searched every crate, every notebook, every shadow of the chapel. Nothing.
only the mark left in dust where it had been. When Arendt questioned the curator, the man tilted his head. "There are 17 plates," he said softly, "one for each of you. That is how it has always been." But they had counted only 16. Unease began to spread through the group. Meals were taken in silence. Notes were written, then crossed out, rewritten, torn apart. The air grew warmer each night, the candles bending as if under a breath too close to name. And that's when Dr. Roth made her discovery. While studying one of the larger fragments, she noticed faint indentations along the edge, marks that didn't match the language, but
formed a pattern of spacing, like pauses in speech. When she read them aloud, as rhythm rather than words, the metal seemed to vibrate under her fingertips. She stopped immediately, but Arendt insisted she continue. He recorded the sequence phonetically, then attempted to replicate it. At first, nothing happened. Then, the sound began, a low hum, the same that had once haunted the walls of St. Veritas centuries before. It grew slowly, resonating through the floor, through the lantern glass, through the bones of their hands. The curator said nothing. He only watched. When the sound faded, they realized something had changed. The remaining plates now bore faint new lines, as though the act of speaking had altered them. That night, Roth refused to sleep. She wrote in her journal, "It's not translation, it's conversation." By morning, she was gone, her bed untouched, her coat still hanging by the door. Outside, no footprints. The curator told them to continue their work. He assured them that Roth had departed early for health reasons, but no one believed him. Days blurred into nights. The scholar's handwriting began to overlap, symbols appearing in margins, notes written in alphabets no one remembered learning. Their voices grew softer, their eyes dull, as if the language had begun to think through them. One evening, Professor Arendt called them together. He had found what he believed was the key, a passage linking sound to meaning. He read it aloud. The words were sharp, cutting, impossible to pronounce cleanly. Each syllable seemed to twist the air, and then the lanterns went out. Darkness, a breath, a sound like whispering through water. When they lit the lamps again, Arendt was standing motionless, his eyes unfocused, his lips still moving though no sound came out. He kept writing the same phrase again and again on the nearest wall. Verbum audit, the word hears. They left that night, those who could still think clearly enough to leave. They took nothing, not the plates, not their notes. The curator did not stop them. He only bowed as they passed. By spring, when a second team arrived to retrieve them, only 8 remained. The rest were never found. Of the survivors, none could fully recall what they had heard. They spoke of echoes that weren't echoes, of sentences that finished themselves, of the sense that the language they tried to read had read them first. One of them, a theologian named Gabriel Worth, left a single note before vanishing months later. It was discovered among his belongings, written in a trembling hand. The word was never meant to be spoken by us. We were meant to be its echo. Today, the copper plates lie in sealed vaults beneath the National Museum. They are catalogued, numbered, but not studied. The ink of their translations has faded to gray, but if you listen closely to the recordings, the wax cylinders used to document their first readings, you can hear something beneath the scholars' voices, a second sound, low, measured, almost like breathing. Some call it interference, others, resonance. But those who've listened long enough say it isn't sound at all. It's speech, waiting, repeating the same words over and over, just beneath the threshold of hearing. Before the word was spoken, it was heard, and the tape ends there, not with silence, but with a sound too human to be a machine. The camera drifts through a corridor of stone. Dust floats like slow-moving ash in the air. The walls seem to breathe faintly, exhaling the age of 100 winters. At the corridor's end, light trembles from a half-open door. Its glow soft, unsteady, almost human. Inside, the scholars have gathered around a single table. It is late. The lamps burn low. The night outside presses against the tall windows like a hand against glass. For weeks they had been cataloging parchment from beneath the old chapel, thin sheets bound in resin, still damp when unearthed. The ink shimmered darkly, like something still alive. The language was unknown. No record, no cross-reference. The words seemed to write themselves differently each morning. But tonight, they had decided to read. Dr. Weiss stood at the head of the table, a careful man, rational to a fault. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the first page, smoothing it beneath a sheet of glass. He glanced at the others: Leisure, the linguist from Lyon, Professor Ainsworth, the theologian, and Sister Agnes, whose presence had been sanctioned by the local diocese for moral oversight. The candles hissed softly, and the silence deepened. Weiss adjusted his glasses, leaned forward, and began to speak. The words came slowly at first, brittle with uncertainty. A rhythm took shape, deliberate, cautious. The syllables carried a strange internal echo, as if spoken twice. Leisure, listening, frowned and began to copy them down, but his pencil left faint indentations instead of marks. The graphite seemed to dry before it touched paper. Ainsworth muttered that it must be humidity. Weiss kept reading, and that's when the first candle went out. No draft, no movement. Just gone. The others followed, one by one, each extinguishing with a sound like a small gasp. The final flame bent toward the parchment, flared white, then steadied again. Weiss paused. Something glistened on the parchment's surface. The ink was moving. At first it seemed like moisture condensation rising from the damp page. But then Leisure saw it. The lines of text were crawling backward, as though being swallowed by the page itself. The black spread upward, tendrils of script reversing their descent, bleeding into the fibers of the paper. And yet Weiss kept reading. His voice grew softer, lower. The words lost structure, sliding into sounds no one recognized. Each syllable seemed to drag on his breath. Sister Agnes clutched her rosary and whispered a prayer, though she wasn't sure to whom. Ainsworth's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, but he didn't move closer. He only stared. Then the smell began. Not smoke, not decay, something metallic, wet, the smell of an open wound. The ink had begun to pulse. Tiny beads lifted from the page like droplets of mercury, climbing against gravity. Weiss blinked. He tried to pull his hands away, but his fingers had already darkened, the stain spreading between his knuckles, threading along the lines of his palms. He whispered one more word, then he collapsed. His chair fell backward, striking the floorboards. The parchment fluttered, landing face down beside him. The remaining candle guttered violently, then steadied again, casting long shadows that trembled like something alive. For a long time, no one spoke. Leisure was the first to move. He knelt beside Weiss, 2 fingers on the man's throat. His skin was cold, but his pulse still fluttered. A thin line of ink had seeped from his mouth, curling down his chin, tracing the shape of a word that wasn't there. On the table, the parchment had dried completely. Ainsworth turned it over. Every line was blank, except one. In the center of the page, written in a faint trembling script, were 6 words: the tongue that devours itself. No one claimed to have written it. No one dared to read it aloud. By morning, Weiss awoke in the infirmary. His eyes were open, but he didn't seem to see. His lips moved soundlessly, forming the same motion again and again. Leisure leaned close, trying to hear. The movement was identical to the final syllables Weiss had spoken the night before, but now there was no sound, only breath, only form.
The attending physician wrote catatonic episode in his notes, but something about it didn't fit. Weiss's throat was swollen from the inside, as if bruised by words that had never fully left him. His tongue bore darkened veins like ink trapped beneath the skin. They moved him to an isolation ward. The rest of the scholars resumed their work, quietly omitting the previous night from official logs. Only Ainsworth refused to continue, insisting that they close the archive, but curiosity outweighed caution. By the second night, leisure had convinced them to resume translation, this time without reading aloud. They transcribed in silence, tracing each letter visually, careful not to form the sounds. The atmosphere grew heavy, as if the air itself were thicker. Sister Agnes noted that the words seemed to shift when no one was looking. Tiny distortions in the margins, the edges of letters curling inward, like petals closing at dusk, and though none of them spoke it, they all felt it, the sense that something had begun to listen. Weiss remained unresponsive, but each morning new markings appeared on the walls of his room, thin lines in black looping like handwriting. The nurses blamed leaking pipes, damp soot, tricks of shadow, until one morning, when a single phrase emerged clearly across the plaster above his bed. "I remember the taste, they scrubbed it clean." It came back the next day, and on the following night, one of the orderlies reported hearing movement inside Weiss's room, slow footsteps, as though someone were pacing, reciting something under their breath. But when they opened the door, Weiss was still in bed, eyes open, unmoving. The floorboards, however, bore faint trails of black footprints. Bare, wet, leisure began to show signs next. His notes became erratic, filled with repeated fragments, half-translated lines that dissolved into meaningless shapes. When questioned, he insisted he was copying exactly what he saw. The letters, he said, were changing faster now. They didn't want to be still. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and then one evening, when the wind pressed hard against the old windows, he returned to the sealed parchment from the first night. He said he could hear something beneath the paper, a faint rhythmic sound, like breathing. The others dismissed it as exhaustion, but later, when Ainsworth entered the room, leisure was gone, only the parchment remained. Its surface rippled faintly, as if something had recently been beneath it. Sister Agnes tried to end the work. She wrote to the bishop, she packed her things, but before she could leave, she discovered that her rosary, once silver, had darkened completely black. The beads left faint smudges of ink across her fingers. She burned the parchment she had been assigned, but the next morning, it was back on her desk, edges crisp, text unburned, as though it had never touched flame. Only the corners bore faint traces of soot, arranged like fingerprints. By the week's end, the scholars stopped speaking to one another entirely. They worked in silence, surrounded by flickering light and the sound of turning pages. The walls themselves seemed to hum. One night, Ainsworth wrote in his journal, "I no longer think this is language. It is not meant to be read. It is meant to be remembered." When the cleaning staff entered the study the following morning,
Table was empty. The manuscripts were gone. The candles were burned to stubs. Only the faint scent of iron lingered in the air. In Weiss's room, the walls were clean. The writing had stopped, but beneath his tongue, a single symbol had been carved, an open circle devouring its own tail. He died shortly after, and though his body was buried in consecrated ground, no grass ever grew over the soil, and so the record ends. No one knows who finished the transcription. No one knows where the text was taken, but some say, if you whisper those 6 words, the tongue that devours itself in a silent room, the air thickens, the candles bend, and something begins to listen again. The voice isn't heard, it's remembered inside you, waiting for the breath that will speak it back. The corridors of the university stretched like veins through the dark. Stone walls held the night's chill. Dust drifted through the thin light of a single lamp that swung slowly at the end of the hall. Each sway sent its shadow crawling across the floor, back and forth, like breath. It was past midnight, and yet someone was speaking. The faint murmur drifted from the lecture wing, measured, deliberate, rhythmic, the cadence of a teacher's voice. Words rose, then fell, forming the shape of a lesson. But the hall was supposed to be empty. The doors had been locked since dusk. Ainsworth heard it first. He had been walking back from the infirmary after visiting Weiss's room, or what remained of him. He stopped at the junction between corridors, notebook still in hand. The sound came from the 17th hall, the classroom that no longer appeared on the official map. He moved closer. The air grew colder, and beneath the whisper of that unseen voice, something scraped faintly, chalk against slate. When Ainsworth pushed open the door, the room lay dark. Desks gathered in neat rows, covered in sheets of dust. The blackboard at the far end bore faint marks, not of chalk, but of something oily, like ink rubbed into stone. He stood there, waiting, listening. Nothing. De both. Then, as he turned to leave, he noticed a faint outline on the board, a sentence, almost invisible, until the light caught it. Attend. He stepped back. The word faded, and the sound of chalk continued. Somewhere behind the walls, by morning, the others had heard it too. The ledger, pale and trembling, claimed he'd woken at 3 to the sound of a lecture in the hall, beneath his quarters, a lecture delivered in no human voice. He described it as a chorus that wasn't many voices, but one stretched thin. The words themselves were unintelligible, but the rhythm of instruction was unmistakable. Pauses, inflection, the cadence of teaching. They searched the halls at dawn. Every room was empty, but on the desks of the old theology wing, they found open notebooks filled with new writing. The ink was dry, the handwriting unfamiliar. Ledger ran his fingers across one of the pages. The letters felt raised, embossed, like they had been pressed upward from below. Every line began with the same phrase, "He who listens will be unmade." And yet, none of the scholars admitted to writing it. That afternoon, they sealed the doors to the West Hall, but the sounds did not stop. They only moved deeper. At dusk, Sister Agnes heard footsteps pacing the archive basement, deliberate, measured, the sound of someone lecturing to an unseen audience. Each time she approached, the voice would stop, only to begin again once she turned away, and the notes continued to appear. Margins filled themselves overnight. The original manuscripts, the ones salvaged from beneath the chapel, now bore new additions, faint and tremulous, written in languages no one recognized. Ledger insisted they were self-generating patterns of ink diffusion. Ainsworth disagreed. He said the margins were teaching. Each morning, they found new symbols, diagrams, sentence fragments, strange instructional phrases. Unlearn what was spoken. The word corrects the mouth. Stone remembers. By the 4th night, half the scholars refused to sleep. The student who broke first was Clara Henslow, a young archivist, bright, eager to impress. She'd been assigned to inventory the recovered scrolls after Ledger's disappearance. Her report from that week remains in the university archives, a fragmented, uneven account written over sleepless nights. They are speaking again beneath the floor. I hear desks being moved, as if the old classes continue. Sometimes I catch words. They sound like instructions. When I listen too long, my thoughts move in circles. Her supervisor found her sitting on the archive floor the following morning. Her eyes were open. Her hands were pressed tightly over her ears. The nails had drawn thin crescents of blood along her temples. She would not stop whispering. She kept repeating the same phrase, "They're teaching from the stone." After that, she didn't speak again,
By the week's end, the university had begun to decay in subtler ways. The bells, once regular, rang at strange hours, sometimes without striking. The air inside the chapel thickened with the smell of dust and oil. The clocks no longer kept time evenly, and the walls of the 17th hall began to darken near the baseboards, as though shadow had weight. Ainsworth recorded in his private journal, "The building is remembering itself. The rooms we sealed find new doors. We are not alone in these halls." The other scholars ignored him. They told themselves it was fatigue, isolation, the strain of too many nights buried in ink and silence. But something had changed in their handwriting. The letters curved differently now, elongated, angular. Some pages bore symbols that matched no alphabet. Others contained words they didn't recall writing, words that appeared between their own, sliding into the spaces as if completing their thoughts. When asked, Ledger admitted he'd begun hearing sentences in his dreams, fragments of a language without sound. He said they felt instructional, like being corrected from within, and every morning, new notes appeared beside his bed. One night, Sister Agnes ventured into the chapel alone. The building was silent except for the faint creak of settling stone. She carried a lantern, its light trembling against the walls. At the altar's base, she found new carvings in the floor, faint lines etched into the flagstones. They formed concentric circles, words spiraling inward toward the center. She could not read them, but when she stepped closer, the lantern flame bent slightly toward the markings. She thought she heard breathing, then voices, soft, layered, speaking from beneath her feet, the same cadence as a lecture. She dropped the lantern, the glass shattered, the flame went out. In the darkness, she heard the voices rise, slow, patient, teaching something she could not understand. She ran. Her shoes struck stone in frantic rhythm, but the sound behind her matched her pace perfectly, echoing one step too late. When she reached her quarters, she found her prayer book open on the desk. Every page was blank, except one. Across the center, in pale ink, a line read, "Attend." The next morning, Sister Agnes left. No one stopped her, but a week later, her body was found near the river, half submerged. Her mouth was full of dust. Her tongue had turned black. The coroner's report listed suffocation, but Ainsworth knew better. He wrote in his final entry, "They are not ghosts. They are lessons without teachers." The words live here now. The remaining scholars tried to leave, but every exit seemed to lead back to the same corridor. They began to sleep in shifts, the sound of invisible lectures continuing through the night. Some claimed to recognize their own voices among the chorus, repeating phrases they had never spoken aloud. And still, the notes kept appearing. Entire sections of their research now bore corrections in unfamiliar handwriting, as though the texts were grading them. The annotations were meticulous, instructive, precise. They explained errors of translation no one had noticed. Ledger began to obey them. He rearranged his notes according to the new guidance. His translations grew stranger, not inaccurate, but invasive. The words no longer described meaning. They produced sensation. Reading them aloud caused his throat to tighten, his ears to ring. He said it was like language remembering how to speak. Ainsworth begged him to stop. Ledger didn't respond. That night, his voice joined the lectures. By the following month, only 2 scholars remained, Ainsworth gaunt, sleepless, and Dr. Miriam, the historian who had first mapped the 17th hall. They lived in the library now, surrounded by locked cabinets and unlit lamps. The walls seemed to hum faintly, vibrating with a low resonance that made their teeth ache. Miriam said the stone was vibrating with sound too low to hear. Ainsworth disagreed. He said it wasn't vibration, it was breath, that something beneath the foundation was inhaling, slowly, patiently, waiting for them to answer back. And then one morning, they found new writing on the main door of the library. deep gouges carved into the yoke. Mira traced them with her trembling fingers and whispered the translation, "Attend." It was the same word that had followed them from the blackboard, from the chapel floor, from the walls of the 17th hall. And that's when they heard it again. The faint shuffle of feet in the corridor, desks moving, chairs scraping, a collective breath before a lecture begins. They listened. The voice that followed was calm, clear. It spoke in measured rhythm, as though delivering a familiar lesson. Only one phrase could be understood, whispered softly between syllables too low for hearing. "He who listens will be unmade." Mira began to cry. Ainsworth covered his ears, but the words continued inside his skull, not sound, but shape. Each sentence rearranged thought itself, twisting memory, erasing time. The library lights flickered, the air thickened. Ainsworth tried to speak, but the sound that left his mouth was not his own voice. It was the same tone he had heard echoing through the empty halls for weeks. Measured, calm, instructive. He realized then, they were the students now, and the lesson had already begun. The last entry in his journal ends abruptly. The words are beneath the floor. They have roots. When we listen, they grow through us. After that, silence. No one knows how long the lectures continued. When the authorities finally entered the building months later, they found every desk perfectly arranged, books open, pens poised midline. No sign of struggle, but on the walls, faint outlines of figures remained, silhouettes pressed into the stone, as though the surface had once been soft enough to hold them. And across the blackboard of the 17th hall, written in a trembling, near invisible hand, was a single phrase: "Class dismissed."
The ink was still wet. No one ever found where it came from. The laboratory was silent, but not still. Light from a single lamp trembled across the glass jars and brass instruments, catching on the dust that hung suspended like ash. The walls of St. Veritas seemed to breathe faintly, a rhythm too subtle to name. It was the first week of November, 1899. The scholars had stopped sleeping. Ainsworth stood at the long oak table, staring at the phonograph that waited like a mouth. Around him, sheets of parchment were spread in precise circles, filled with copied fragments of the recovered manuscripts. Each mark had been traced by hand. Each stroke followed the curvature of symbols that no one had managed to translate. They believed the answer was sound, that language could be understood, not by reading, but by resonance. Dr. Mira adjusted the brass horn of the phonograph, her fingers trembling. She had been the one to suggest the experiment. Her voice was calm, but her eyes kept flicking toward the crucifix above the door. The metal was darkened from years of candle smoke. "Words are frequencies," she said softly. Perhaps they were never meant to be spoken, only reproduced. They did not know how wrong she was. The recording began at precisely 3:14 a.m. The clock in the corner struck once, and stopped. Ainsworth read from the fragment they had chosen, his voice low, uneven. The others followed, tracing the phonetic reconstruction of the symbols aloud. At first the sound was harmless, just a string of hollow vowels, almost melodic. Then, the tone shifted. A tremor rippled through the air. The windows quivered in their frames. Ink in the open bottles began to climb the glass necks, pulled upward by some invisible current. Mira froze. Weiss clutched his ears. And yet Ainsworth kept reading. The phonograph needle scratched against the wax cylinder, capturing every vibration. The sound grew denser, low, resonant, like breath compressed into stone. That's when the crucifix began to tremble. At first it was subtle, a faint vibration. Then the nails securing it to the wall began to rattle. Glass in the cupboards cracked. The flame of the oil lamp flickered outward, bending toward the center of the room, as if drawn to the sound. Ainsworth stopped reading. Silence. No one spoke. The needle lifted itself gently, the recording complete, but something wasn't right. The echo of the chant did not fade. It lingered, in the walls, in their skulls, in the air itself, like a note held too long. When they replayed the cylinder the next morning, it produced no sound. The phonograph spun in silence. The needle moved perfectly, but no vibration touched the air. They listened closer, leaning in. Mira whispered, "It's blank." But the moment she spoke, a faint murmur rose from the plaster around them, thin, like wind under a door. The walls themselves were whispering, echoing the cadence of the chant. It wasn't the recording that spoke, it was the room. Over the next days, the phenomena grew stronger. Instruments in the lab began to hum. When left unattended, the copper wires trembled as if charged. Every time they spoke near the walls, a faint delay returned their words, not quite an echo, but an imitation. Ainsworth started leaving notes for himself, short observations scrawled in a shaking hand. Voices persist after speech. Air carries structure. The silence records. They decided to conduct a second experiment. This time the phonograph would not record a chant, it would play it back. The idea was simple: to reproduce the captured resonance and measure its effects. They placed the machine in the 17th hall, still sealed from the rest of the university. The air there felt heavier, the stone walls darker with moisture. When they wound the crank, the cylinder began to spin. No sound came forth, but the walls exhaled, a soft rhythmic pulse, almost a heartbeat. Mira stepped back, her candle flickering violently. The wax splattered across the floor. Weiss muttered something about resonance transfer, though his voice trembled too much to hide his fear. And then the sound began, not from the phonograph, but from the stones themselves, a slow vibration too deep to hear, that made their teeth ache. The crucifix nailed to the far wall began to sway, and for a single moment, Ainsworth thought he heard words inside the hum, familiar syllables, shaped by breathless voices. He leaned closer. The wall was cold, but beneath its surface, something moved. That night they found fractures running across the windows of the theology wing, fine lines, spreading outward from invisible points of impact. No one had touched the glass. The janitor swore he'd seen shadows flicker between the cracks. Ainsworth dismissed it as fatigue, but he didn't sleep. The whispers returned around 2 a.m., not loud, but insistent. They spoke in layers, voices overlapping in strange rhythm. Each phrase seemed to correct the last, like endless revisions of a sermon. Mira pressed her ear to the wall. It felt warm now, and then faintly, she heard her own name. She stumbled back. No one else had heard it, but Ainsworth saw the expression on her face, wide eyes, trembling lips, and he understood. The walls were remembering them. By the end of the week, the university began to change. The air grew dry and metallic, leaving a taste of iron on the tongue. Candles refused to stay lit. Ink dried mid-sentence. The phonograph left in the 17th hall would sometimes spin on its own, always at night, always without sound. One evening, Mira entered the hall alone to retrieve it. When she came back, she couldn't speak for hours. Her hands shook violently. She wrote only 2 words in her notebook. It breathed. When pressed for more, she refused. Ainsworth inspected the machine. The wax cylinder was blank, but the brass horn was damp, as if it had exhaled. He stared at it for a long time, until the metal began to fog slightly under his breath. Except he wasn't breathing anymore. Soon even the daylight hours felt wrong. A low hum followed them through the corridors, barely audible but constant, like a room holding its breath. When they spoke, their own voices seemed thinner, less distinct. Mira noticed that sound no longer echoed properly. Even footsteps felt muted, as though the air absorbed more than it returned. On the 5th night, Weiss collapsed during another test. His nose bled. When he regained consciousness,
He could only repeat a single phrase. The tone was inside me. After that he stopped responding to his name. The surviving notes from Ainsworth's journal became increasingly erratic. Lines of careful observation gave way to fragmented impressions. Walls vibrate when no sound produced. Language alive, reshaping air. We are the experiment now. 2 nights later, they discovered a new development. When the phonograph was moved into the chapel, the crucifix began to tremble again. But this time, without the machine being wound. Mira saw it first. The small iron nails securing the figure began to twist in their sockets, turning counterclockwise, as if unscrewing themselves from the wood. The statue tilted forward, inch by inch, and when it fell, it did not strike the ground. It stopped, suspended in midair for half a breath, before slowly swaying backward against the wall. The air around them shimmered faintly. Ainsworth whispered, "It's playing." He was right. The room vibrated with the inaudible pattern of the chant, tones too low for hearing, too precise for imagination. They realized the phonograph was only a conduit. The real recording had already been made, in the walls, in the very stone of Saint Veritas itself, and now it was replaying them. Mira wanted to leave. She said they were listening to themselves from inside out, that the vibrations were teaching their own voices to forget how to stop. Ainsworth refused. He believed they were close to understanding the principle behind it, a resonance between written and spoken form, like the echo of divine language misapplied. That night, he recorded one final session. He spoke into the phonograph directly, reciting the chant from memory, alone in the 17th hole. When he finished, the machine stopped. He leaned in to listen to what had been captured. Silence. Then faintly, his own voice, but slower, lower, and underneath it, another voice, repeating each word half a breath too late. Not an echo, a correction. Ainsworth backed away, knocking over his chair. The voice continued, whispering the words differently, reshaping them, like language adjusting itself after a mispronunciation. He fled the hall, but the whisper followed. By morning the phonograph was gone. Only the wax cylinder remained, still spinning, though the crank had not been wound. When the others entered the hall, they heard faint murmuring within the walls again, stronger now, clearer, the same chant, but not in any human tone. It resonated through the floorboards, the windows, the crucifixes, until everything trembled in unison. Mira fell to her knees. Ainsworth covered his ears, but the sound was already inside him. Every breath aligned with the rhythm of the chant, every heartbeat synchronized with it. The building was breathing again. No record survives of what happened next. The final note in Ainsworth's handwriting reads, "We replicated the word. It remembers us, and it is still speaking." When investigators arrived months later, the phonograph was found in the chapel, rusted, fused to the floor by heat. The walls bore faint impressions, waves, concentric and symmetrical, spreading outward like ripples in water. When they struck the stones with their hands, the walls gave a dull hum in return, a tone too low for the ear, too steady for silence, and somewhere within it, a whisper. The halls of Saint Veritas were never meant to be seen at night. The windows along the east corridor reflected only themselves, tall, black panes, where the eyes expected moonlight. Dust hung suspended in the air, like ash from an invisible fire. Somewhere below, a bell struck once, though the tower had been silent for decades. A slow, amber light pulsed beneath the door of the lecture hall. It was after midnight, when the rector crossed the courtyard, coat drawn tight against the wind. The gravel made no sound beneath his boots, as if even the ground refused to speak. From the windows above, the faintest movement, curtains shifting, or perhaps someone watching. He had ordered the research stopped, every archive locked, every phonograph confiscated, and yet the sound of chanting had returned. The porter had described it first, voices like a class in progress, though the term was over, though every student had gone. The rector dismissed it as an echo of the mind, but tonight, even he could hear it, low, rhythmic, measured like breathing. It came from Lecture Hall 4, the oldest on campus, built atop what had once been a chapel crypt.
He reached the heavy door. Beneath it, a thin seam of gold light trembled against the stone. His hand hesitated over the latch. The metal was warm. He pushed. Inside, rows of benches half lit by the glow of 100 candles, their flames bowing and straightening as if obeying unseen instruction. In the center stood a ring of men and women, heads bowed, notebooks open to pages filled with the same spidery script. The 17 scholars. He called out, softly at first, then louder. None turned. They stood motionless, mouths moving in perfect synchrony, breath forming vapor that rose like smoke. The sound was not Latin, nor any language he knew. It vibrated, a tone that seemed to hum inside the bones of the walls. He stepped closer. The air thickened. His ears began to ache. A low pressure behind the eyes. The candles nearest him flickered out, and that's when he saw it. On the floor, chalk lines forming a perfect circle, each symbol mirrored around a single Latin phrase he had seen once before, carved into the sealed iron door beneath the east wing. Verbum absconditum, the hidden word. He whispered it aloud. The circle trembled. One of the scholars, a woman at the far end, suddenly gasped, hands clutching her throat, but no one moved to help. The others only continued the chant, faster now, their voices merging into a single unbroken note. The rector stumbled backward. His foot struck something, a crucifix fallen from the wall. It vibrated in his grasp, the metal cold and alive. He dropped it. The candles blew out in unison. Silence, then a soft scraping sound, paper shifting, chairs creaking, pages turning themselves. The light returned, not from flame, but from the floor, the chalk lines glowing faintly like embers under ash. He tried to speak. His voice came out as breath. Across the room, one of the scholars looked up. His eyes were open, but the pupils had turned pale, glassy. To when he spoke, the tone matched the low hum in the rector's skull. It must be finished. The others echoed, it must be finished. Curated, their hands rose not to heaven, but toward the ceiling beams, as if tracing something that hovered just beyond sight. The rector backed away. He felt the handle behind him, but it would not turn. The wood had swollen shut. Then, light, a blinding flare erupted from the center of the circle, white as lightning, soundless as breath. He threw up his arms. When he opened his eyes again, the room was empty, benches overturned, pages scattered like fallen leaves, and on the floor, 17 robes, charred black at the edges, arranged in a perfect ring. The rector fell to his knees. The air smelled of iron and ink. On the lectern, a single open notebook, its pages unburned, the final entry written in an unsteady hand. We spoke, and it answered. He tore the page free, folded it, and fled into the hall. Behind him, the door shut with a sound that echoed down the corridor like a breath drawn inward. When morning came, the porter found him seated in the courtyard, the page clutched in his hands, staring at the burned window where the light had been. He would not speak for the rest of his life, but witnesses claimed that some nights, long after he was gone, the lecture hall lit again from within, a faint pulsing glow, steady as a heartbeat, and if one stood close enough to the door, they said, they could still hear the sound of pages turning. The snow fell soundlessly over the courtyard of St. Veritas. What had once been a place of learning now sat in stillness, its arches buried beneath white silence, its windows sealed with frost. Only the crows seemed to remember the name carved above the gates. When the police arrived, the wind had already erased most of the footprints. 2 constables stood by the main entrance, uncertain if they were trespassing. Inside, the corridors smelled of damp paper and oil, and something faintly metallic like blood long dried into stone. The lamps flickered when they turned them on, though the generator was steady. At first glance, the classrooms looked untouched, the books stacked neatly on desks, coats still hung by the doors, even cups of ink, frozen mid-reflection, waited as though the scholars might return at any moment to resume their work. But something wasn't right. The silence felt intentional, not absence, but suppression, like a room holding its breath. Inspector Karel Benthorn led the team through the main wing. His boots echoed softly, the sound swallowed before it reached the end of the hall. The door to Lecture Hall 4 had been sealed shut with iron nails, warped by heat. He pressed his hand to it, cold. When he asked the rector what had happened, the old man just stared at the floor. He didn't answer, he simply muttered a single line, one the stenographer barely caught. They opened it. The team proceeded with care. Dust still floated in the air, though no one moved fast enough to disturb it. The police photographer, a young recruit named Rice, set up his tripod near the front of the hall. He adjusted the focus, raised the lens, and froze. Across the blackboard stretched a dense scroll of markings, circles within circles, strokes looping through themselves in shapes that resembled no known alphabet. The chalk seemed fresh, but when touched, it left no residue. "Someone's been here," Race said quietly. Benthorn shook his head. "No one has." He ordered photographs taken from every angle. Race clicked the shutter. The flash burst bright, then again, and again. When he lowered the camera, his expression changed. The negatives were blank. He thought it was a malfunction, the plate not set, the film spoiled by light. But when he checked the rest of the roll, every other image was perfect. Desks, walls, lamps. Only the blackboard showed nothing, just an empty wall of slate. Race tried again, this time using a Polaroid. He watched the image bloom in silence. For a moment faint lines appeared, the edges of the markings, then faded, dissolving like mist. He swore under his breath. The Benthorn approached the board himself. He ran a gloved hand across the surface. It felt smooth, too smooth. The chalk had sunk beneath the grain, leaving no texture, no powder. That's when he noticed something else. At the bottom corner, in letters almost invisible beneath the sheen, someone had written a phrase. Latin, custodi verbum, guard the word. They recorded the phrase in their notes. But by the time the team returned to headquarters that evening, the page was blank, ink gone, paper clean. The report was rewritten 3 times, each attempt shorter, less coherent, as if the memory itself resisted documentation. 2 days later, a black car arrived from Rome. No markings, no insignia. The men who stepped out were not police. They carried credentials marked with the seal of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The rector, upon seeing them, crossed himself and whispered, "They've come." The Vatican delegation spent only 1 night inside the university. The constables were ordered to remain outside the gates. At dawn, the bell tower struck 3 times, though no one had touched the rope. When the doors opened again, the men from Rome exited carrying a single wooden crate, unmarked, sealed with red wax. One of them paused on the steps and addressed Inspector Benthorn directly. "The site is now under the Doctrine Preservation Order number 12, he said. "You and your men will file no further reports. This investigation is closed." Benthorn objected, citing the missing persons, the evidence of heat damage, the vanished notes, but the man simply handed him a document stamped Secretum Pontificum. The rector was taken away for medical care. By evening, a new team had arrived to board up the windows and reinforce the doors. The blackboard was removed, its surface wrapped in lead, and placed into the same crate the Vatican had sealed.
When Benthorn asked what would happen to it, the only answer he received was, "It will be preserved." But preserved where, no one said. Weeks passed. The university's name was removed from state records. Letters sent to Rome went unanswered. And yet, inside the evidence archive of the local constabulary, a single photograph remained, one that Rees had taken accidentally when his camera misfired during the flash. At first glance, it showed only blur and motion, but under magnification, faint lines could be seen emerging from the center of the frame, curved and looping, almost like handwriting forming itself. The Benthorn kept the photograph in his desk for years. He never showed it to anyone. When asked why, he once said, softly, as if afraid to wake something sleeping nearby, "Because every time I look at it, the lines are different." He retired soon after. The university fell into disuse, overtaken by moss and ivy. Windows shattered. The bell tower collapsed, but no one ever dared rebuild. And on winter nights, when the snow lies heavy on the stone, locals claim the faint glow of a lantern still moves through the lecture hall windows. A single figure, standing before a clean black wall, writing in air that leaves no trace. The stone steps leading beneath St. Veritas were slick with damp, their edges worn smooth by centuries of careful feet. A faint draft rose from the darkness below, carrying with it the smell of earth and old paper, dry, brittle, and impossible to ignore. The air felt thick, heavier with every step. No light reached these tunnels, save for the lanterns carried by the archivists who dared approach. The archive had been sealed in 1901, locked behind iron gates, reinforced doors, and layers of bureaucracy. No scholar had crossed its threshold since, and yet, the sound persisted. They called it the sealed archive, though archive suggested neutrality, records to be studied, organized, preserved. This was not neutral. It waited. Inspector Carl Benthorn returned once more, long retired but still drawn by rumors of the archive's presence. He had been told nothing about the condition of the doors, or the corridors that led to them. When he reached the entryway, the iron gates loomed, like the jaws of a beast. Rusted hinges protested as the keepers unlocked the padlocks, but the sound did not echo. It seemed absorbed by the walls. Inside, the corridor narrowed. The stone floor was damp. Moss grew between the cracks. Water dripped from the ceiling in uneven cadences. Lantern light revealed nothing more than a hallway, lined with doors that had not been opened in decades. One door at the far end dominated the space. Black iron, cold to the
touch, etched with symbols almost identical to those that had appeared in Lecture Hall 4, verbum abscondatum. But this time, the phrase seemed to hum faintly, vibrating beneath the skin of the hands that pressed against it. Benthorn swallowed hard. He leaned closer, and that's when he heard it. A faint scratching, not from the floor, not from outside, but from within the walls themselves. Chalk scraping, pages turning, and a soft voice just beneath hearing, whispering a single line repeatedly. The lecture is not finished. Archivists had tried before. One, a linguist named Marek, brought tools, journals, even small cameras. They recorded nothing visible, but each attempt ended the same way. Marek returned hours later, pale, eyes wide, muttering lines in languages he had never learned. "No one leaves unchanged," he whispered once. "It speaks, and it teaches." No one believed him, at first, until the next attempt. A student of theology, sent by the Vatican for official cataloging, descended with Marek's guidance. The lantern light trembled across the walls. He pressed his hand to the cold iron of the main door. Coals ran through the metal. The hinges rattled on their own, and the voice came again. "The lecture is not finished." It was insistent now, pressing into the ears, pressing into the mind. Marek backed away. The student tried to photograph the door, but when the images developed, the surface appeared blank, smooth as stone. Even the etchings were gone. The moment the camera shutter clicked, the whispering grew louder, though still inaudible to others in the hall. Only those standing closest could feel it vibrate inside the skull, like a message meant to be felt rather than heard. They tried every method: chemical analysis of the metal, temperature readings, seismographs. Nothing detected movement. Nothing explained the vibrations. Yet each visitor reported the same sensations: a sensation of being observed, of being corrected, of words spoken just beyond comprehension. One report described a librarian pressing her hand against the door for mere seconds. When she withdrew it, the imprint of her palm remained faintly on the metal, and within it the same looping symbols as the blackboard in Lecture Hall 4. She swore she had not drawn them, and they vanished when photographed. The university itself seemed to enforce silence. Outside, birds avoided the courtyard. The ivy refused to climb near the entrance. Even the wind seemed to pause at the iron gates. Visitors left pale, clutching notebooks full of observations that made no sense when reread. Words shifted, lines realigned. To one archivist tore his notes apart and burned them, yet later found them reassembled on his desk, exact replicas of what he had tried to destroy. Benthorn pressed his lantern against the door again, as he whispered the Latin he remembered. Custodi verbum. The iron vibrated faintly, like a pulse, and he heard the voice again. Closer this time, clearer, as though it had been waiting for him. The lecture is not finished. No one knows exactly what lies inside. The archive remains sealed. The key is held by the Vatican. Security is constant. The university administrators speak only in dismissive tones. And yet, reports continue. Those who attempt to enter describe the same phenomena: chalk scratching invisible lines, pages flipping without wind, faint whispers in languages that bend the tongue and the mind. Some hear syllables drawn from memory they did not possess. Others, nothing at all, until later, when the sensation arrives: a pressure in the skull, a faint resonance in the chest, a lesson begun and never concluded. Benthorn visited once more, decades after retirement. He stood outside the sealed doors, listening. The air was cold and damp, smelling faintly of ink and wax. The sound came, soft, gentle, insistent. The lecture is not finished. He pressed his ear to the iron, and for a long moment, he felt the weight of centuries pressing back. The archive was awake and patient. The city skyline had changed, but the ground beneath it had not forgotten. Where St. Veritas once stood, a modern library now rose, steel and glass replacing stone and mortar. Its walls gleamed in the sunlight, reflecting a world that had moved on. Yet at night, the shadows were different. The perimeter lights hummed softly. Air conditioning rattled in even rhythms. And sometimes, when the wind shifted just so, the faintest echo of old stone corridors seemed to press against the glass. The night guards noticed first, a flicker at 3:17 a.m. Lights along the top floors glowing for a moment, then extinguished as though nothing had happened. They told themselves it was electrical, a timer, faulty wiring. But something wasn't right. The building felt too attentive, too aware. Inside, the shelves were orderly. Computers hummed. Students no longer walked the halls of theology or forbidden science. They walked past encyclopedias, journals, and digital archives, oblivious to the ground they now occupied. Yet some nights, the library itself seemed to speak, a low vibration beneath the floor, a draft through vents that carried the faint scent of ink, wax, and old wood, a whisper so subtle it could be mistaken for imagination. The lecture is not finished. Staff reported sounds of pages turning, soft as breath. Chairs shifted slightly,
as if aligning themselves with invisible desks. One guard swore he saw a shadow tracing a semicircle around a reading table, bending like a body, learning its posture, though no one was present, and that was when he heard it, a voice from nowhere and everywhere, reciting fragments of forgotten lectures, words in languages he could not recognize, words that twisted in meaning the longer he listened. Knowledge spoken aloud, it whispered, can become prayer or curse. The guard shook his head, certain of the strangeness. His flashlight flickered. The echo of footsteps followed him down the hall, though he was alone. Historians who visited the site for research found the walls strangely resonant, echoes of conversations long gone, phrases half remembered, reverberating faintly in empty rooms. One scholar attempted to locate the original foundations, digging in the basement. His instruments detected nothing. No cavities, no tunnels. Yet at exactly 3:17 a.m., every sensor recorded a spike, faint vibrations, unexplainable. When he reviewed the data, the readings seemed deliberate. Patterns, curves, loops, like chalk writing itself on invisible blackboards. He asked the library director about the timing. Nothing happens at 3:17, she said, but the guard insisted otherwise. And then the scholar noticed the windows, reflections that didn't align, shadows behind walls that should have been solid. Visitors also described a feeling of being observed, not by people, but by the building itself. Seats would shift slightly when turned away. Books fell without cause. Digital displays flickered to show text long erased. One student researching St. Veritas found her notes rearranged the next morning. Words she had written were gone, replaced by sentences she had never learned. And at night, in the quietest corners, a faint scratching sound could be heard, chalk on invisible slate, pages turning without touch, whispers that carried lessons centuries old, as if the building remembered every scholar who had ever passed through. A janitor, who had worked the night shift for decades, described seeing a figure at the top of the main staircase. No features, only a silhouette, bowing over a desk, writing in the air. When he blinked, it vanished, and yet the sensation remained. The smell of dust and ink lingered. The chill in the air pressed against his back. He did not return for another week. The library administration forbade after-hours access. Security cameras monitored every hall, yet the disturbances persisted. Researchers who attempted to log them scientifically found results that vanished when reviewed. Reports disappeared from computers. Photographs developed blank. Even video recordings returned empty frames during the hour of 3:17 a.m. It was as though the building itself had erased the evidence. On rare occasions, the old foundations beneath the library shivered. Staff described a low hum beneath the floorboards, growing louder, then fading suddenly, like a teacher calling roll in a class that no longer existed. Some whispered that St. Veritas had left a mark. That knowledge, once spoken aloud, carries memory, and memory, if persistent, can become presence. A prayer, a curse, a lecture without end. The city moved on, but the library waited, silent in appearance, active in absence. And at exactly 3:17 a.m., the lights flicker, the air vibrates, and somewhere in the vast modern halls, the faintest whisper, insistent and patient, repeats, "The lecture is not finished." The university was demolished, the records erased, but somewhere, beneath the new library, the lesson continues, and attendance is mandatory.